Welcome, everyone. Morning. Welcome, everyone here in person and also online. I'm Tony Pippa. I'm a senior fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development here at Brookings. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here today for this event on advancing inclusive development in rural towns, actionable strategies for improving economic opportunity, quality of life, and quality of place. So we've got coffee and snacks here in person and at home. Go get your own, but just settle in and get comfortable because we've got a lot to learn today. And throughout this morning, you're going to hear lessons from the experiences of an in-depth learning lab conducted by Brookings and LISC, the Local Initiative Support Corporation, in 3 rural Indiana towns. A learning lab devoted to advancing economic inclusion by linking disinvested rural districts to broader regional growth strategies. Now, I lead an initiative here at Brookings that's focused on improving the effectiveness of federal policy to support equitable community and economic development in rural places and small towns across America. As part of that initiative, I also host a podcast called Reimagine Rural, shameless promotion. Find it anywhere you listen to your podcasts. And for that podcast, I visit towns across rural America that are experiencing positive social and economic change and get the story of how that change is occurring. So I get to hear a lot about what's happening in small towns across the country. But I wasn't involved in this piece of research. So you might be thinking, what the heck am I doing up here welcoming you all? And first and foremost, it's because I believe that this piece of work actually is a really important contribution to our understanding of how that change is happening in rural places. And I commend Hannah Love from Brookings and Bill Taft from LISC and all the others who were involved in this project. And it's especially gratifying to see the serious focus of my colleagues from the Metro Division, what we call the Metro Division here at Brookings, on rural places, and to understand the interdependence between those smaller places and those larger jurisdictions. But let me set the stage just a bit more. So earlier, I get asked to speak a lot and to go to a lot of places. And earlier this week, actually, I was at a gathering where we were talking about outdoor recreation economies in rural places. And a participant said, you know, we need a better story for rural America. Okay. Well, I couldn't agree more that major media and influencers and decision makers can really improve how they talk about and portray rural America. And look, rural places have certainly borne the brunt of some of the geographic divergence that we've experienced in the country. 85% of the persistent poverty counties in America, for example, are non-metro. But I also wanted to respond that rural America already has a better story. We're just not seeing it clearly. And it's not just a better story for their communities, but for all of us, because it's showing us what sustainable, inclusive communities are and can be. And so that's why I was honored to be invited to help kick us off today. So let me just make 3 quick points before I turn it over to Hannah and Bill to present the framework and some of the lessons from the work that they've done and point us toward what I'm sure is going to be a really rich panel discussion. So one, this work is an important contribution, I think, to really capturing and reflecting the approach to rural community economic development that I've seen organically evolving all over the country in the recent past, though in Indiana, as you'll hear, it's been intentionally supported with serious investment. But historically, economic development in rural places has often meant extraction of their natural resources, or it's been like a fishing expedition. You know, let's go hook that large employer from outside the area that's going to bring a lot of jobs and investment. But that often reduces kind of the local economic agency and decision making. And it can actually turn into kind of an economic monoculture that's really vulnerable to shocks and to changes. The communities that I visit and experience that are thriving, or at least seeing positive changes occurring, they've really been focused on improving their quality of life, the quality of their place. They've been leveraging the pride in that place. And we'll get deep into what we mean by that today in the conversation. But they're taking an approach that leverages the assets that they have. Sometimes those are natural, but it's also human capital. It's a lot of different kinds of capital. And they seek to build that economy. You can call it bottom up, you can call it inside out, but it's really supporting local entrepreneurs, local businesses, the main street being kind of a center of community, and seeking to keep the value of those assets local as well. And I'm really interested to hear some of the lessons about what's made that actually viable through the Learning Lab. And secondly, as they do this, these local leaders are focused on creating a sense of belonging and kinship and connectivity for their residents. They want to share the benefits widely because they recognize that their community's distinctiveness is an asset. And the connection that their residents feel towards their community is important for sustaining their community's resilience and their economic future. So they're experimenting with new forms of governance, civic collaboration, and we'll hear about that across jurisdictions, and civic engagement. I mean, I feel like these are the local leaders that understand that belonging is going to be a watchword for successful rural communities of the 21st century. And finally, these local leaders sense that all these processes or these strategies are about producing something much less tangible, but actually more valuable than currency, and that's hope. And despite what you might hear about rural America, that is happening in communities across the country, and it's the models of transformation that is producing that hope that I think should dominate our story of rural America. So I'm really excited to sit back this morning and learn the lessons from the Learning Lab about how these experiences can help take that narrative forward. So to get us started, I'm really pleased to introduce Hannah Love, who's a fellow in the Auntie and Robert M. Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking here at Brookings Metro, and Bill Taft, who's a Senior Vice President for Economic Development at LISC, and has led their Midwest division and been in Indianapolis, just to come forward and to lay out for us the framework and what you've gotten from the Learning Lab. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Tony, and thank you everyone for being here with us this morning, as well as those who are there online. My name is Hannah Love, and I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution, where my research really focuses on the intersection between placemaking, and inclusive economy building.
And again, I'm Bill Taft with LISC, and LISC is Local Initiative Support Corporation. We shouldn't assume everybody knows who we are. We are a community development financial institution that's invested $32 billion since we were started in '79, and we exist to support community-based activities We are often known for our housing work, but for the last few years, I have been working to support our local offices and our local partners and having a greater level of partnership and impact in the economic development space. Really, this idea of bringing community economic development as a reality of how we do our work, not just community development and economic development. So that's really our push through the work of my team.
And so we're going to share with you today, as Tony previewed, some really in-depth learnings from a multi-year learning lab that we conducted in 3 Indiana towns. Before we dive into that, though, I just want to give some context for this broader work and the partnership between Brookings and LISC. So we've been partnering for about 5 years now on several publications, all with the one theme of advancing what we call community-centered economic development. And that really is about how can you invest in those districts and those neighborhoods within regions that have often been neglected or disinvested in, and how can you support those areas in order to build strong regional economies. So the publication that we will be talking about today, you can see here on the left. I encourage everyone to take a look at it, to read it, and to download the PDF. But this also builds on broader work that we have done in 14 different communities across the country, across 9 different states. And so if you're interested in checking out that work, you can also see those publications there. And what is interesting about the model that we will be giving an overview of today is that it's really meant to be adaptable to places of all sizes. So this is a map of the different areas that we've worked in directly on the ground to implement community-centered economic inclusion. And you can see that there's a broad range of places from sort of Los Angeles and other major metro areas to more suburban areas, and then now with the addition of Indiana, more rural areas. So we're going to be sharing with you sort of the lessons that we learned as we were taking this model to rural areas. It wasn't all easy, which you will hear on the panel, but we do have a lot of concrete recommendations for both practitioners and policymakers on how they can support this kind of work. Before we get into that, I just want to set some broad level setting about sort of why the moment is so ripe for inclusive economic development in rural areas. So as Tony mentioned, rural areas do face very severe and systemic barriers to opportunity. They account for 85% of the nation's persistently poor counties. That is the narrative that we are most often used to hearing when it comes to rural America, is this deficit-based framing. That is not the framing that we will be taking today, and we will be focused on sort of the assets and the trends that are really exciting in rural America that make this moment so important and potentially transformative. So the first is really what we see over the past several decades, is that rural areas have become increasingly demographically diverse, and rural communities that embrace that diversity are more likely to succeed than others. So what this map is showing you is sort of the change in people of color that exists within rural areas, and you can see across the entire nation, we're often seeing these rural areas diversify. So by the end of 2024, a whole 24% of the rural population was people of color, but that's varies significantly based on region, and you see much higher concentrations within the South, the Southwest, and the Southeast. The second is that we are also seeing rural economies diversify. So oftentimes in mainstream conversations about rural areas, there will be a focus on maybe farming or agriculture or manufacturing, where we've actually seen a significant decline in those industries in rural areas, while we've seen growth in other industries such as real estate and rental leasing, as well as professional and scientific services. So while we've seen sort of a loss of traditional industry, there's been an exciting opportunity for places to really redefine themselves and what their economy can look like, particularly and how it can benefit people that already live there. And a core component of that is really about the importance of small businesses to rural economies. So we see that in rural areas, non-metropolitan areas, small businesses with under 50 people account for 42% of all employment. That is compared to 28% in metro areas. So while we see declines in traditional industry, we're seeing a lot of innovation, particularly in entrepreneurship and small business development. And then most importantly, rural areas are home to significant assets that can be leveraged for economic development as well as for quality of place. So these exist from sort of natural resources, recreational assets, as well as historic building stocks and other really unique place-based assets that can be leveraged for economic development with the right tools. What motivated us to do this project is often we see that those tools are not being applied equitably or effectively to rural areas. So when we went out and were talking to folks conducting interviews in Indiana, we often heard statements such as this. You know, we have jobs actually that pay well here. We have more jobs than we can actually fill with workers. The problem is no one wants to live here because there's no investment in quality of place. We cannot retain our population. We also heard that there's a significant lack of local civic infrastructure at the place level that makes it more difficult for rural areas to then begin to organize themselves. So there's been great work at the Main Street level. National Main Street has done excellent work in revitalizing rural communities, but when you go outside of downtowns, there's very little civic infrastructure there that can be leveraged for economic development. And then finally, we also see patterns in which the traditional extractive model of economic development has led to severe inequities within rural communities, and that new investment, sometimes particularly in terms of recreational assets, is served to benefit outsiders rather than rural residents themselves. So that's what you can see here with this quote about development on the lakefront always being for rich people and not for us. So this is really sort of the broad motivation that inspired us to launch this learning lab, which I will hand over to Bill to explain.
So obviously, through Hannah's words and the information we've seen here, you get a sense of the fact that Brookings really has some great insight, as well as analysis of the data that we see, and from listening to Tony's comments of just what the rural opportunity is and some of the challenges as well. And through the last 5 years, we've been, the LISC Economic Development team has been also working with the Bass Center at Brookings to look at this idea of inclusive economic development. Hannah mentioned the places we're doing that. But the question kept coming up, well, what about, our initial work was in large cities and looking at sections of large cities. And so how does this framework of inclusive economic development land in a rural place? And does it? Is it useful? And so I think, as you saw, one of the things we realized is that data is a key piece of understanding who your community is and then moving to action. And that's something that's been a key part of this inclusive work, but often is not part of what happens at the local level in small communities. And so I'm really excited about the fact that we were able to work together with Brookings and bring this sort of framework of analysis and then helping communities act on that. But the question is where? So one of the things we realized was when we started on organizing this learning lab, we were coming out of the pandemic. Small towns were really struggling with even just the capacity to do things like spending ARPA. And so where does it make sense to actually work with multiple communities and attempt to deploy this sort of framework with the community? And ultimately, we narrowed in on Indiana. Now, full disclosure, I'm from Indiana. I live in Indianapolis. I grew up in one of the 3 towns, which I was really excited to be able to work on. I did not pick Michigan City, but I was very excited to be able to work with the city of Michigan City. So, there's another really distinct opportunity that led us to do this and in Indiana, and that is Indiana has really an unprecedented $1.25 billion investment called READY, which is a state funding that's being invested in quality of life and quality of place region by region across the state. And that basically is investing in the priorities that that region sets for economic development. But really, when you think about the economic development they're addressing, as Tony mentioned, it's this more holistic approach of like, what does it mean for quality of life and quality of place so small places can be competitive? And so, and it really goes back to talent and this idea of how do we grow and keep talent in small communities, because we know that that's what's going to be driving the economy going forward. So ultimately, the 3 towns that we focused in on came off, there were like 2 phases of READY. In the first phase, some communities really benefited and ones did not as much. And so when we started talking with the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, who's managing the READY Fund, about this idea of working with them, of doing the Learning Lab in 3 communities that were READY communities, they identified Michigan City, Seymour, and Warsaw as 3 that they felt like gave us variety of geography. So Michigan City is in northwest Indiana, Warsaw is in northeast Indiana, and Seymour is in southern Indiana. That would give us a variety of experiences, types of communities, different economic bases, et cetera. Michigan City is the largest of the cities, has 32,000 residents. It has an African-American population that's about 27%. Is traditionally a manufacturing city, but also mashed up with a beach community because it's right on Lake Michigan. So an interesting, very distinctive economic background. Seymour has about 21,000 people. It is a community that is historically a farming community, but has really become a manufacturing community. Has a rapidly growing Latino population that, because of the jobs that have been created there, there's been this great growth of opportunity, but also a lot of stress on things like housing and schools because of that, of the growth of population. And then finally, Warsaw is about 16,000 residents. Warsaw calls itself the orthopedic capital of the world, and with some justification. There are a couple of manufacturers of, if you got a hip or a knee, or you have a relative that did, often those were made in Warsaw. And so it is an area that has generated a lot of wealth in some pockets, but has struggled with making themselves a place that can hang on to talent. And because of that, they are concerned about the future of that economy, and because of that lack of ability to hang on to talent in their community. So those are the 3 communities that we focused on, and in each of those communities, our partner was a local economic development organization that is IEDC's partner. So that's how we kind of got linked to that. Not a traditional community development. For those of us that work for LISC, we usually work with community development corporations, nonprofits that kind of grow out of that background. In this case, we're working with what we call LEDOs, local economic development organizations, as our key partners. And one of the things that came out of this work is that we realized that their job, their challenges, the things they're being asked to take on, that we saw in the process are very much community development challenges and quality of life challenges. So the first question that we addressed with them is talking with these LEDOs and our key partners there was, where do they want to focus? And one of the things we realized was this idea, the Bass Center does a great job of talking about specific place-based investment and development, and doing that in an equitable way. But the question that a lot of small towns face is that we've never really thought about neighborhoods. We think about our town, we think about maybe the downtown, but there actually are neighborhoods within small towns. And so the question is are there particular places that are strategic to invest in within a small town, subsets of that community, that maybe there's historic disinvestment, but also great opportunity? And so we worked with each, using data provided by Brookings. We worked with each of those communities to analyze the residents, businesses, and also the physical space. And through that, working with the communities, identified specific areas that they chose to focus on. In Michigan City, on the top map, you can see they chose neighborhoods that wrap around the downtown. One of the things that's happening in Michigan City is they have the last interurban that runs in the United States. For those of you who are railroad nerds, it connects South Bend to Chicago, and Michigan City is a key stop on that. But it took too long to get to Chicago for commuting because there was only a single track. So they just double-tracked that, and so there's a real new opportunity for Michigan City to capitalize on that, and the downtown in particular. the leadership locally, but was concerned, they wanted to make sure the neighborhoods and the residents and the small businesses that wrapped around downtown were going to benefit from that and not be displaced by that opportunity. In Seymour, they had just completed a bypass around the southeast side of the city that connected two industrial districts, one that was on the interstate and one at an old airport. And that particular bypass captured what was farmland inside of that up against the community, and also is directly adjacent to the largest concentration of Latino residents. So, and then in Warsaw, the challenge they looked at was downtown. If you can see, there's actually two lakes, one on the north side and one on the south side of downtown. Tremendous opportunity to draw that into a quality of life, build on those connections to those natural assets to strengthen the quality of life in downtown. There's also a commercial corridor on the south side of that, Winona Avenue, that has a large concentration of immigrant-owned small businesses that had not had enough investment to be fully successful, and also had deteriorated infrastructure and was poorly connected to the rest of downtown. So they really wanted to focus on that area. So that's the really kind of the scale we were looking at, is almost a neighborhood scale, but within a small town, which was a distinctive approach. Each of those communities then took the data that we generated about that particular area, convened key stakeholders, and really tried to convene stakeholders from across traditional silos. And small towns have silos too. They just tend to not be all located locally. But you have a workforce development system, you have an economic development system, you have infrastructure, you have local government, you have county government, you have regional economic development officials, and they seldom get in the room together to focus on a particular place. And so this was an opportunity to convene those folks. One of the beauties of working with Alito is that they have great connections to all those stakeholders. And so they were able to convene very effectively those organizations, and to get them in the room and talk and first present them with that data about that particular part of the community, and then think about, okay, are we effectively connecting the people and the businesses in these areas we're focusing on with what's growing in our regional economy or not? If not, how do we make those connections more effective? So that was the first step, and then they started talking about ideas for how to actually do that. And what they came up with was basically 4 areas of goals for each of those communities. And the first one, this idea of economic ecosystem, I'm just going to give you a few examples from each of these that came out of the communities. All of them really kind of go back to this idea of people being the greatest assets these communities have, and how do they develop people, give them opportunity, give them great places to live and interact, and to make those cities more competitive. So on the ecosystem side for small businesses, sort of a traditional line between that and housing. But what we found is in every one of these communities, one of their biggest challenges was around housing, and quality, affordable, up-to-date housing was something that that came out of these processes as really important. And what we found in all of these communities, there just hadn't been much housing development in the last, since the 70s. And so all of these communities really were desperate for housing, but also the question is, what kind of housing and where does it go? And so some great ideas these are both examples from one for Warsaw on the left, Michigan City on the right, both of which have lakefronts, of actually reactivating. The one on the left is an old fairgrounds, which is really underused, that could be used for mixed use, including a lot of housing development. And on the right-hand side is an old power plant site for Michigan City that's scheduled for close down, and is a site that could be really some interesting mixed use there as well. So housing is definitely a very common thing, and it was viewed as a health issue. Access to food was another key issue in some of those communities. And then in the built environment side, one of the things that Warsaw really struggles with is how do they physically link to those lakes. And I think one of their ideas was to actually use this idea of redevelopment of the fairgrounds to both create more housing, but also create a physical link, a walkable, a bikeable link between downtown and the waterfront. There's no place to actually, that's public space, to be on the waterfront. It's adjacent to downtown. So that was an asset and amenity that they really wanted to focus on. And really all three of these towns had what we called opportunity sites. And these were either formerly industrial sites or public use sites like the fairgrounds, or in some cases agricultural land that has become captured within cities' growth and probably should be integrated into the grid of the community, but has been sort of skipped over, and is an opportunity in places where there's a real housing shortage. It's a real opportunity to create housing that's a walkable location that's integrated into the community, but that the infrastructure to do that is not available.
Okay, so I'm just going to walk us through briefly some of the lessons that we learned through this process, and then I'll hand it off to our panel, who is really the real experts here and can get real honest with y'all. So the key lessons that we really learned from this, the first is on challenges. So as Bill mentioned slightly at the beginning, there wasn't really the muscle for taking a place-based approach within these communities, right? When they thought about place-based, they often thought about at the regional level, but there wasn't the muscle for doing corridor or neighborhood level development. That took a little bit of sort of massaging with data and really understanding how your investments within these particular corridors can help the region writ large. That was something that took new exposure. And part of that also was because there were very few organizations that work at the hyperlocal or neighborhood level scale. So not only was it sort of the muscle memory wasn't there, there also wasn't the capacity or the organizational infrastructure there in order to do that. We also initially encountered some hesitancy around the word inclusion, not because towns were opposed to the idea of equity and inclusion, but because there was a perception that perhaps this is something that would be imposed on them by outsiders. And so there also took a lot of sort of understanding and discussions about what inclusion means and how it's not just a buzzword from DC, and that inclusive development can be sort of bottoms up and distinctly rural. Then we also saw sort of more heightened silos between local and regional levels. So there were just less, local housing developers. There weren't local workforce organizations. You really had to sort of go to the next town over if you wanted to get that. And so it was really difficult to sort of bridge some of those silos. On the positive side, though, we found that there was a lot less planning fatigue and a lot less sort of distrust. When you do this work in urban areas, often, particularly disinvested communities, have been surveyed, researched, planned over and over and over again, and that leads to a lot of distrust. We did not see that here, and we saw a lot greater enthusiasm for people to participate in this process. They were excited to even be asked. And we also saw sort of more room for innovation and creativity because there wasn't as much disillusionment. Finally, at the end of this, some of the positive lessons that came out of this is we really did see these regions embrace a more holistic approach to economic development. One that recognizes that, childcare is an economic development strategy, housing is an economic development strategy, and so is quality of place. That is something that really was somewhat of a new idea, but we got significant buy-in for that. We also saw a lot of new momentum for catalytic development in traditionally sort of underutilized properties. So Bill mentioned the fairgrounds in Warsaw. There's also the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, which is set to close, right? So there's a huge opportunity there to revitalize that area for community-centered uses. And while we were very aware of sort of the implementation and funding gaps, there's less philanthropic capacity, there's less resources, we also saw some really innovative strategies for filling those funding gaps and capacity gaps, which I know Mayor Angie from Michigan City will discuss.
So from a policy recommendation standpoint, these are really fairly high level, and they will be implemented at different levels of government as well as philanthropy to make this happen. But the first thing that we just really saw is the need to build capacity of organizations. This is a challenge every place that LISC works, but it's particularly true in small communities. And the challenge there in particular is organizations that the groups we work with are probably arguably some of the best resource groups in those towns. These are the local economic development groups funded by local tax dollars. But they're being asked to do things they haven't been asked to do in the past. As Hannah said, it's things like housing development, childcare, skills training, job pathway creation. All those things are not traditional economic development. So there's a need to help those groups retrofit their skills and their tools to be able to take on these challenges that are more holistic, that really are what economic development is at the local level today. Secondly, the second piece really ties into that, and that's this idea of do we actually support this more holistic vision through the economic development tools that exist. A lot of these tools are actually wielded by state government, and so are they ultimately going to adapt those tools to support this more comprehensive approach to economic development? And then also, are you going to, the philanthropic community, where often there are community foundations in each of these that were part of the process, are they going to see economic development as something that is worthy of philanthropic investment in a way that maybe is a little different than they did in the past? So there's this more holistic approach will bring new partners and new approaches. And then finally, in the area, this idea of, will we hold the tools that are available for economic development accountable for this kind of adaptabilities to what the challenges of rural America are? So ultimately this idea, we're recommending that we scrutinize the resources that go into economic development, both at the local, state, and federal level, to make sure that it's thinking in terms of these other frameworks and the true challenges that small towns face today. So we're going to talk to the people who are the real experts, and we have representatives that were part of this process. So I'll ask them to come up to the stage while I introduce you. So we have Angie Nelson Deitch, who's the mayor of Michigan City, and we have Vincent Ash, who is the chief of staff for the Indiana Economic Development Corporation. And we have Nadia Villagrán, who is the vice president for our rural programs for LISC and has more of a national view of these issues. And so we're going to have a nice conversation about some of these questions. So, Mayor Angie, how is this process different than previous planning processes, particularly in the economic development space, that Michigan City had undertaken?
So thank you to Brookings and LISC for allowing Michigan City to participate in this opportunity. Just a little bit about Michigan City. We're about 60 miles east of Chicago. We're about 29 square miles, and you mentioned our diversity. But one of the things that's important about the areas that were selected is that I grew up on the east side, predominantly African-American, the west side predominantly African-American, and there has been very little investment. And as a part of the business community, most plans in Michigan City were done by business people who never lived in Michigan City before, right? So you have all these plans that go on the shelf because, you know, they host the meetings in downtown or at a local business or government facility, and no one from those neighborhoods were ever included. So the difference in this process is that we have something called the Hope Center, helping our people excel on the west side. And all of the meetings for this particular process was held there. There was food involved. We invited people from churches. We invited people from the neighborhood. We included nonprofits, people who never had an opportunity to give their voice or lend their voice to any type of process. So usually those plans happen to you and not with you. And so they sit on the shelf, and then a new administration comes in and it's on the shelf. We have like 8 great plans that are sitting on the shelf that no one has ever looked at. So I've been in office 9 months, full months, but I was on the city council and a part of this process from the beginning. And we were very intentional in making sure that we included not only local residents, but regional. We included workforce agencies. We included the regional planning team. We included anyone that had any type of resource or impact to Michigan City. We had them at the table. We had our arts and culture organizations participate. So, and then we broke bread. We had food. We held it on the west side. We made everybody feel welcome. And I think that was the difference, is that you didn't have chamber members who, don't live in Michigan City, but only pass through Michigan City to get to their job, making decisions for Michigan City.
Yeah, I remember one of the meetings, one of the business representatives that was there saying, can we just do this? Doesn't the mayor have to convene this? And this idea that like the community just hadn't, all the previous initiatives had been very political and very sort of narrow, and this was a much more comprehensive and holistic. You did a great job of gathering that very broad representation. But now you have this Vibrant Michigan City plan that is an economic inclusion agenda, is what we call them sort of generically, and that has a 3-year plan for advancing several specific goals. But what kind of investment do you have to make locally to actually pull that off? Well,
there were a couple of things. So we, as a city council, I was on the city council prior to this, I put forth a recommendation that we provide ARPA resources, and that's our American Rescue Plan dollars, to hire someone through the Michigan City Economic Development Corporation. Her name is Erin, and shout out to Erin. Erin is handling what we call our Vibrant Playbook. So she is responsible for that. So we funded that. And I thought it was important that we had a resource that focused on it so that we would have a plan on the shelf still, again. And so she's running, and it kicks off tonight, as a matter of fact, our Neighborhood Leadership Academy. We talk about capacity. She also managed our small business grant program, where we had a significant number of people who receive grants through ARPA. And a lot of those were daycare providers, early child care facilities, small businesses that receive that. But her goal, her number one priority, is our Vibrant Michigan City Playbook. But also going through this process allowed us to apply for an ERC fellow through the IEDC. So we received Ezzy Redwood, who is now, we have him for 3 years as well, to focus on entrepreneurship. So he's really focused on placemaking, arts and culture as an economic development tool, and then business readiness. So we have 2 full resources now to help us continue this work. And I thought it was very important that as we move through these next 3 years, that this playbook is like our guiding light and our guiding star when we start applying for grants and utilizing those different resources.
Thank you. So Vincent, with IEDC, puts a lot of resources out the door to support economic development. This is not your traditional investment. Why did IEDC support this learning lab, and what were the challenges in doing that?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Bill. It's a pleasure being here. Great to be here. So good morning, everyone. It really starts with change in philosophy. So I would say the IEDC in the past, probably I would say about 5-6+ years ago, really operated as a true kind of Department of Commerce, so to speak. And a lot, very transactional when we worked with communities, when we worked with different businesses. That shift in philosophy from a transactional organization to a strategic organization allowed us to think more holistically about how we're approaching economic development as a way to attract talent, as a way to retain a lot of the businesses that we have within our state. And so underneath the IEDC umbrella, we house our entrepreneurship innovation teams. Our small business development center is actually housed within that group from a statewide perspective. We've been doing a lot more from a marketing component and just telling our story a little bit more nationally. We have our traditional business development teams that are focused on retaining and attracting companies as well as foreign direct investment. But about 3 years ago, we actually launched Ready One, and in that started a department to focus more on the built environment and have investments go towards quality of place and quality of life, specifically with that program and a few others. And so we realized that in a way to really attract talent, to really be able to retain the businesses and attract the businesses that we want, that economic development is really changing. It is not being led by getting the large user in a community. It's more so a lot of companies are now making decisions based off of where the workforce is. And so we kind of have flipped economic development on its head as a way to, especially in post-pandemic kind of society, of saying a lot of remote work, people can live pretty much wherever they want, that we need to focus on building quality communities. And so that philosophy we have kind of taken forward to like this Ready program, which is now, of course, $1.25 billion. So at the time, a couple years ago, we had an influx of ARPA funding, and so the first round of Ready was actually funded via revenue replacement via ARPA. The second round was out-of-state surplus dollars. Hopefully we can continue to making those investments long terms, but the reason why we wanted to fund this program specifically is that we've seen, as we worked with a lot of communities across the state, that they just really didn't have the capacity to think through or be even set up to take advantage of the funds that we had. And so we picked these. Bill alluded to the uniqueness of each community. We felt like picking these 3 communities that have similarities to a lot of other communities, not only in our state, but across the country, we felt like we can take what we learned in these communities and duplicate it in others across the state.
So what are the biggest challenges for that kind of duplication? What are you going to have to do in order to have more of this kind of thing happen?
The biggest thing is probably funding, definitely funding, and hopefully we could, again, continue to be sustainable moving forward. The other challenge that we have is really getting interest from the private market. Especially in real estate development. As we speak to a lot of developers, it is easy for them to convince their stakeholders, their financiers to invest into more metro markets because the ROI is there and it's less risky. It takes a significant amount of subsidy, especially since most times there's not been a lot of new development in more rural communities. It takes more subsidy to get those projects done. The hope is that you only have to do maybe 1 or 2 that is subsidized by the state and local government significantly, and then you kind of create that snowball effect where you have the comps and you don't have to subsidize it as much. But getting that interest from the private market is the biggest challenge, in my opinion, to be able to continue efforts in rural communities.
Thanks. So Nadia, you work with rural communities around the country. How relevant is this conversation and this experience from Indiana to other rural communities around the country?
Yes, thanks, Bill. I appreciate being here. Good morning, everyone. Rural LISC is a network basically of about 150 community-based rural partners. And we started this organization or this program within LISC 29 years ago with the idea of helping those organizations identify the opportunities in their community to address the needs in those rural places. And largely they were affordable housing development organizations, entities that were bringing forward that response to the need for housing. But quickly, we realized that those organizations, as they were leading the community conversations across their rural places, were being asked to approach other parts of the work that happens in a rural community, the childcare, the economic development, the Main Street supports. And so very quickly, community development became community and economic development. And I love the idea, Bill, of saying community economic development without the and, because there doesn't need to be a division there. What we've seen is that housing is an economic development driver, and so is it a place for us to house the opportunities, the conversations that need to happen in a community so that more growth and advancement is possible in those places. I have these incredible statistics from my colleague Krista, who helped me bring this together. Our network drives local investment. In 2022 alone, we had 64 partners who invested $3.1 billion in total development, which equals into 10,000 units of affordable housing. And what they've done is that they've used that housing as a place to hold meetings for those community conversations, to talk about to house childcare centers and medical clinics in those rural places. But what we've seen is that those leaders in those affordable housing developments, they are oftentimes tapped to do much more than that. And so Mayor Angie was talking about how some communities feel like they're not included in the conversation. Well, what we hear is that our leaders in those organizations are often wearing many hats. They're often asked to be a part of those conversations. And so they're very open to the idea of others being included in the conversation, more resources, more passion for that community to be included in the conversation to drive this forward, which I think why this playbook is so important.
So we've been talking about this, and one of the challenges is sort of the traditional network of community-based organizations in rural areas often have not worked as closely as maybe they could with traditional economic development structures, and certainly haven't been able to tap into some of the funding streams that go towards that. What's it going to take for that to change?
We've been talking about this quite a bit in the last few days, and I think switching the conversation on the ground about this, oftentimes people feel like the resources are finite, right? And so they're constantly competing with their neighbor for these funds, but they're not realizing that they're not tapping into a whole batch of funding that's available to a community simply by how you communicate what this is going to do for the local residents. And also, I think the other part of it is that housing developers have a unique opportunity to include their residents, the folks that they've already worked with, to share in what else is needed in a community. And that, again, will then drive that conversation about how economic development, community development, tapping these multiple funding sources will collectively improve the community. And so we just think more conversation is a key part of this.
Can I add to that? We talk about capacity as well, and I know that we've sent a few of the residents that participated to Ball State for their community development course. I think having those conversations with the local public and getting them engaged to understand what it is. I think so many times we talk about developing and finding that big fish of a manufacturer, and so they don't understand that development takes time. We hadn't had new housing in decades. We have our first new subdivision in over 50 years. So I think letting them know that infrastructure is important, letting them understand through this Neighborhood Leadership Academy what government does and what economic development is and community development is important, because there was no baseline, prior to going through this process. So I think that's important too.
You started to get at my next question, which is, what do you need from each other? So when you think about the different constituencies that you each represent, how do they need each other for this to be successful in lifting rural communities?
I always say, bring me the money. No. I think funding is important. READY is important because we received READY 1.0 dollars for our prison reimagination study. So we're talking about over 100 acres of land. And that prison is moving about 15 miles away. And what the beauty of the picture that you showed with the chapel, behind it is one of the newest national parks in the United States. So you have the lakefront with our power plant being decommissioned by 2028. Then you have the national park, and then you have the prison adjacent to it, to one of the poorest areas of our city. So now you're talking 200 acres. So what does that look like? And I think going through this process, it really put it at the forefront for the residents to understand you need to be a part of the process. And, now we need the state to figure out, okay, there was no taxes coming to Michigan City from the state prison, but now we have an opportunity to replace that. So we're going to have to be very engaged with the state from that standpoint, but also in READY 2.0, we're looking at workforce housing. And all of the workforce housing is going to be important as we have these quantum corridors that are starting to prop up across the region. We have to have housing, and I think that's what's important. And then from a federal standpoint, I think it's having access. As a mayor, my whole thing is I need to have direct access. I can't compete against a LA or Detroit. We still have to have direct access to funds that are available. And right now, this is the best opportunity we've had in a long time. So, we're always, putting out, information, but we need technical assistance. We don't have the bandwidth. I happen to have a background, in utilities, but most of us don't that are, government officials. And we don't have the capacity or the dollars to pay for technical assistance. So that's what I need, money.
Other thoughts on what you need from each other?
So, I would say collaboration and partnership and really just communication. I commend this process of being, kind of led from a local level and from the grassroots on what makes sense for their community. The READY program is set up the same way. It is not a top-down approach on this is what we feel like you should be funding. We did get a little bit more descriptive in READY 2 because we've learned a lot through the first round and having some KPIs and goals related to childcare, housing, population growth is always going to be there, and some other factors because all those impact quality of life overall. But ultimately, it's the communities that are, bringing forth the projects that, that they see is going to be beneficial to them. So that communication and just partnership and, just collaboration as a whole is what I feel like helps drive a lot of good quality projects throughout the state. I would say in Indiana, I feel like we do collaboration pretty well, and it's not hard for us to convene a lot of different stakeholders in one room to help move missions forward. So that's a big thing. Of course, funding is, I think, going to be critical. We actually, as a part, so READY, we talk about $1.25 billion. $1 billion of that was, again, half of that was ARPA funds. The other was state surplus. We did get $250 million from the Lilly Endowment to add on to the program to focus on arts and culture, blight reduction and remediation, and vacant building rehab, as well as capacity building. And so as a component of that $250 million, we are launching a capacity building kind of cohort and fellowship program, which we hope to have live sometime next year to really give a lot of communities throughout the state just more technical expertise and capacity to be able to move a lot of these plans forward.
And I would just add that I love participating in events like this because you hear the real stories on the ground of what's happening and what's possible. And I think I would ask you both to consider taking this on the road with me. I mean, truly for us and the network that we represent, it's a lot of small communities that need to know that these playbooks, that this conversation, that this incredible idea that the state of Indiana had is possible and scalable in their own community as well. And so I think what I've often seen with sharing really good stories about what's happening on the ground is that the funding does come. Those private sources are just as inspired by the passion and the experience and the story that you're sharing, and will follow it up with a conversation about some funding. And so I would encourage you all to join me on some road tours.
Well, thank you. We're going to start opening it up for questions from you all. We do have, while you're thinking about your questions, we also have some that came in from our virtual attendees. So there's over 800 people listening in, so that's exciting. I'll bring one of these up here and we can start off, and then please have your questions ready. So with the shift to remote work, what opportunities do rural towns have to attract new residents and investment without displacing existing residents?
Can I start? Do you mind? You know, for rural LISC, one of the things we saw during this shift to the virtual space is how it shined a wonderful spotlight on the entrepreneurial spirit that exists in rural communities, how if folks are given the opportunity to have access to high-speed internet, to have some small business entrepreneurial counseling to build out their nascent business or this incredible skill that they have, right? They can then build a business on a virtual platform and be inspired and be motivated and see some benefits from that activity. And so I do think that's an opportunity. But with that comes the other side of the coin, which is that we need to invest in our broadband infrastructure. We need to utilize those billions of dollars that are coming down from the federal government in rural places, in small towns, because that's where then you're going to see that true benefit and opportunity for that virtual space to be universal, not just in our big cities.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that there needs to be some programs and controls in place, specifically probably on the housing side. As you think about a lot of remote workers, more of those are white collar, more affluent, higher earners. And so them locating in a lot of rural communities could start pricing, some existing residents out. And so being mindful of that from a planning perspective, I think being proactive and having workforce housing, like Mayor is doing in Michigan City, I think is good. But it's definitely something you got to take with a thoughtful approach and plan ahead. Otherwise, you're playing catch up for the rest of the time. So,
And I think our challenge is the quality of life piece or component of it. Most of my kids included, when they graduate, they don't come back. So it's really about, we have to create opportunities for a vibrant, scene of art, culture. I think that's the piece that's missing for us. Our entrepreneurship ecosystem is growing. We have a lot of local organizations doing that, but I think my kids say, there's not enough for us to do. They go to Chicago. At least it's 60 Minutes now with the double track. But, we want them to live in Michigan City. And I think that's, one of my priorities. We have to create an environment that younger people and retirees want to live. During COVID, we learned a lot. A lot of people who had second homes in Michigan City are now permanent residents. They now live in Michigan City, which is a great thing. But we don't want to just be a tourist town. We want people to live there. So I think that's my challenge, is creating that culture of wanting to be there, and that things are always happening in Michigan City, not just during the summertime.
Any questions from the audience? Yes.
Has that double track that's in your community now, has that increased the opportunity for folks to be, oh, sure, sorry about that. Can you hear me? Hear me?
Mhm.
Anyway, it doesn't work.
I can hear you.
I'll just be loud. Has that given your community opportunity to be a bedroom community for Chicago? Is that a viable commute for folks? Is that a viable commute for folks?
I think it is. I used to drive to Chicago every day to work, so it is viable to do that. But I think the double track is an opportunity, because we're building a brand new mixed-use development right at the train station. So we have apartments that are going in right there. Before, it was just a parking garage that was going to go up, but now people are coming through saying, "Oh my God, you have these huge cranes in your city," and I'm like, "You're going to see a lot of that." But I think, again, if we don't create the culture, people are not going to live in Michigan City. It's really just going to be a pass through or a stop to get to the outlet mall or the casino. And what we want to create is an opportunity year round. And so we need all of those things in place, not just during the summer, but all year round. So, again, we've always been a place to second homes for people, but my priority is about people living in Michigan City and not the second home.
The state has also established a taxing code for transit development districts along the South Shoreline as well. So Michigan City is one of those districts. And so there will be a lot more investments within those districts. Michigan City is also the first one that actually has a housing project.
We are the first
that
one.
utilize the tax code. We supported that at state level as well to help move that project forward. So I definitely think there's a significant opportunity for people who want to evade the taxing structure in Illinois and come over to Indiana to live. So
and let me, yeah, and also what that project though has leveraged for us are federal opportunities as well. TIFIA, I don't know what that stands for, but what it does, anything within a half-mile radius of that train station now is eligible for different financing. So we have 2 workforce projects within a half-mile of the train station, because our goal is, whether you work in Chicago or along the train or even in Michigan City or remotely, now there's opportunities. One of those projects that we put forth has a child care component to it. Another one has more of a entrepreneurial restaurant feel to it. And then we have an RFP that's out right now that we've received back those projects that has a grocery store component to it. So we're being very intentional about what we want now. And I think having that project at the train station kind of spearheaded, and then Vibrant MC around it kind of has given us those legs to move forward. And I think, as you said, now, with the READY and federal dollars, now we're kind of in this trajectory of things are moving really fast. And so we want that to continue.
Other questions? Yeah, back here.
So with the decrease in college jobs, is there a push like in these communities to kind of, if you're not going to go to college, into a trade, skilled labor for these middle class jobs with working wages, so they stay in the community, maybe don't move to Chicago, they have to go to these middle class jobs. Is there anything you can think about that?
Well, I'm a product of our Career Tech Center. So, I did electronics at AK Smith. So right now, the old high school that I went to, Elston, we're working on a project called the Opportunity Hub, and it's focused around workforce development. So it's a collaborative effort to bring a lot of agencies together. It's one of our submissions for Ready 2.0. And our city has already bought into it. I have created a new position. We have a director of workforce and education now. And our goal is to make that the hub of anything needed around workforce. So we want people to go to one place in the middle, and it's in our Vibrant MC footprint, and it's within walking distance from the train station. So our goal is to have adult education, opportunities to get skilled up there, daycare there, food insecurity opportunities there, all of those things in one place. So we're in the middle of that now. The city has put forth some money, about $1.2 million towards this project. So we're just trying to figure that out, because my fear, I guess my fear with everything that's happening, I don't want our residents priced out. So I need to skill them up to be able to have a better wage, to be able to live in better housing and all those things. So that's what we're doing.
Other thoughts on how rural communities are or could create these job pathways into living wage jobs?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak from a state perspective. So we definitely have a diversified industry base that we have in Indiana. So advanced manufacturing actually takes up a significant amount of our GDP, is result for a significant amount of our GDP each year. So a lot of those jobs do not require a college education, but pay very well. And so a lot of the industries that we have been leaning into lately, EVs, battery manufacturing, actually not too far from Michigan City, GM and Samsung announced an investment to build a battery plant there. AWS also announced a hyper scale data center in which we'll have AI computing. So semiconductors as well. So we have a lot of good workforce development partners across the state that provide technical training even at the high school level. So once students even graduate high school, they can get access to some of those jobs. So there are a lot of programs that can be duplicated throughout the state that a lot of schools have already implemented. And we're starting to see a lot more of that. So it hasn't been a significant push or, a college or die mindset throughout the state at all. We actually have leaned a lot more into the skills trade the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years than what we have in the past.
And I would just add that LISC and Rural LISC also does this work, workforce programs that we offer in rural communities and cities across the country. In fact, we just got some money through the GGRF, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, that's going to prioritize workforce programs for green jobs. And so we are expanding in that work as well in rural and small cities. So there are opportunities, and what we like to do is scale programs that are successful in other markets for other rural places.
I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up our formal part of the session, but we will stick around and be happy to have more discussion with anybody who has more questions. And I just want to thank everyone for being here, both virtually and in person. I want to thank our panel for making the trek here and for participating in this, and I saw your thoughtful comments. I want to thank Hannah and her team and the Brookings Institution as a whole for hosting and just for being a great partner in this process. And again, thank you all for coming, and have a great day. We're off the virtual, but if people want to have more